Well, welcome to our last session. We've contended with the technology and we've emerged victorious, clicker in hand. So I think we're ready to start. This is the last panel of our Constitution Day conference, which of course has been framing the frontier, constitution making in the West. And one of the things we've tried to press home as we have examined that is twofold. One, that there is a distinctive contribution that comes from this collection of Western states that framed their constitutions, that had their foundings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that they altered or in some cases improved. We'll focus on the improvements, improved American democracy and made it their own and contributed something distinctive to it. It's one of the reasons that focusing on state constitutions is important. Another is that we focused on state constitutionalism generally. And those who were here yesterday or were even here for lunch to hear John Dinan talk about this know that our state constitutional tradition stands alongside our national constitutional tradition as an important means of self-government. When we talk about constitutional self-government, we too often myopically focus on our opportunities to preserve or alter our federal constitution, which is of course extraordinarily difficult to do. But it is quite within the grasp of peoples in the states, of the people of Utah, of the people of every state in the Union, to alter their state constitutions. And they have done so frequently. Perhaps I'm from Florida. I grew up there. First election I voted in, I had to vote on an amendment about protecting pregnant pigs. So I'm quite conscious that we've sometimes been excessive in our recourse to state constitutions to accomplish things. The legislature can probably handle the size of a pin confining a pregnant sow. But we do have available to us this means. When the Constitution says, we the people do ordain and establish this Constitution in the preamble to the federal Constitution, what gives credence to that claim is not the original act of ratification, but the present ability of the people to change their constitution if they find it unacceptable or inadequate. So that's what we're celebrating. This is how the American people self-govern constitutionally, is largely through their state constitutions. So this last panel features 3 of our current and former Wood research assistants who have worked as undergraduates on the Quill project, our research partnership with Oxford University, with Dr. Nicholas Cole and the Quill project. These students have done the in the trenches work in excavating the sources of the making of these state constitutions, of making them accessible to teachers, to lawyers, to jurists, to researchers, to the public generally. And they have, by doing that, participated in the opening of what is really a path-breaking and expansive new research agenda, new area for research and understanding of constitutional self-government. So I'm going to turn this over to them. They're going to be speaking about religion in Western state constitutions, about which they most certainly know more than I do. Which is a testament to the experience. I want to tell you one anecdote very briefly. We went to the Utah State Legislature with a group of Wood research assistants and with the center. And we were sitting in the Senate chamber waiting for Senator Stephanie Pitcher to recognize us from the floor and mention us. And the students are listening to the proceedings and there are motions flying around and there are all sorts of legislative terms. And a student turns to me and she says, you know, as I hear them doing this, I actually see the legislative process like a graph. I mean, the point was by understanding how this worked, they saw what a state legislature was doing, which is frankly inscrutable to most citizens, and immediately understood what was happening procedurally and its importance. And frankly, if Quill didn't accomplish anything else besides teaching 85 or more undergraduates to understand thoroughly how a legislative and deliberative process works, I'd say we succeeded and the resources were well spent. But we have, in fact, done much more than that, and you're going to see that on this panel. So we have today with us Ashlynn Poelman, Caleb Stowell, and Jordan Artigas, all of whom are going to share with us about religion in Western state constitutions. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hi everyone, I'm Jordan, and today we're going to be talking about how religion developed in the Western states, and primarily also the Mormon question. Before I want to begin, however, I'd like to start off by thanking the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding our research and allowing it to get out. And I'd especially like to thank Pembroke College at Oxford and the people here from there, because they've been invaluable partners to us in helping everything get done the way we've been able to do it. So it's been very nice, and I'd like to give them some thanks. Now, before I begin discussing how these sections of the Bills of Rights of the territories developed, I would like to first start by discussing some of the federal language that helped guide religious worship and freedom of consciousness. And to start with that, I'd like to begin with our First Amendment. The First Amendment, which hopefully most of you have seen before, tells us that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Thank you. Now, this text protects people who are both religious and non-religious, and has become one of the pillars of freedoms that we as American citizens get to enjoy today. Now, obviously, this text deals with what Congress, not the territories, can and cannot do. However, it is upon these sentiments that the provisions within the enabling acts that guide the territories that became states were derived. Now, the enabling act language was primarily, or it actually only affected the territories of the Dakotas and Washington. So we will be discussing Wyoming and Idaho as well, but they were not guided by these enabling acts. But this language gives us clear guidelines as to what was required for these territories to become states. And what we will see in the Dakotas and in Washington, they followed these guidelines with almost no amendments to them in order to ensure their people the autonomy, representation, and guaranteed rights that are protected by the Constitution through the 10th Amendment when becoming a state. And to start, I have those three, well, it becomes North and South Dakota and Washington, but the territories that were guided by this Enabling Act. Now here, the first part that will jump off the page is the part that I have highlighted for you, which is a clause that says, the liberty of consciousness hereby secured shall not be so construed as to excuse licentiousness or justify practices that are inconsistent with the peace or safety of the state. Now, I'll leave the definition for licentiousness till later in Idaho because they go a little further in defining it. But I felt that it was extremely important to highlight this clause because what it shows us is that although these states wanted to respect the religious rights of the people, they also wanted to ensure that freedom of conscience and religious worship was not being used to avoid the laws of the territories that were present. Another thing that Washington gives us that is different than North and South Dakota is a clause that says witnesses or jurors cannot be rendered incompetent based on any opinion of religious matter whatsoever. So Washington actually goes a little bit further in protecting those who may have any religious beliefs or opinions that maybe are different from the normal status quo. And the reason I want to highlight that is because it is that language that actually becomes the primary topic of debate for our first non-enabling act state, or territory, which is Wyoming. Now, with Wyoming, we actually also get that licentiousness clause and the liberty of consciousness clause, despite it not being an enabling act state. And in their juror protections, they go one step further than Washington, saying that it also protects people who believe or do not believe in God. And it is that language, that difference in language, that step further that becomes the topic of discussion in Wyoming. And what we see here on the right is actually the first proposed amendment by a man named Mr. Reiner. And Mr. Reiner proposes to remove the entirety of that competence clause for jurors simply because he believes that what we have defined with that clause is not a competent witness or juror. He says there's no way to hold someone who does not believe in God to their duties as you could with someone who maybe swears on a Bible. So what we're given in Wyoming is there is one person who believes we should take that clause out. However, it does not go over well in the state. There's a lot of debate surrounding that phrase. And it actually, in my opinion, we see this pillar of religious toleration that our founders wanted to shine through this debate right here. The first one I gave you is Mr. Baxter, who tells us that good men who don't know whether they believe in God or not are just as liable to tell the truth as any other man. A man named Mr. Hay tells us that religion has nothing to do with a person's truthfulness, and it is truthfulness that the courts themselves would like most. And then a man named Mr. Hoyt tells us that whether a person believes in God or not, he'll be just as truthful. And he exclaims that he hopes to be proud of our Constitution in every particular, but especially proud of it on account of its breadth and freedom from all prejudice. So what we see here from Mr. Hoyt is that religious freedom is so important. They had to protect, they wanted to establish that truthfulness and believing in religion were not congruent with each other. Even if most of these men talked about not being sympathetic to the non-religious clause as well. So they wanted to shape, in order to ensure their statehood, they were willing to shape the ideals more in line with that of the federal language than as opposed to maybe what we'll see in the next slide, or in the next two slides. Anyway, after they get through debating this section and clarifying what it was meant to do, we are offered a clarifying amendment that passes and becomes the finalized section of Wyoming's Declaration of Rights. This amendment was given to us by Mr. Hay, the one who said truthfulness is the most important thing for a juror or witness. And Mr. Hay tells us he removes the section that deals with whether a person believes in God or doesn't. And so what we're left with is a section that says no person shall be rendered incompetent to serve as a witness or juror because of his opinion in any matter of religious belief whatever, which actually sounds almost exactly like what Washington had. So through this debate, what they did was they actually removed some of the additional language and created a section that was more in line with the enabling states and with the pillar that our founders had wanted and had envisioned for future American citizens. Which brings us to Idaho. Now, what I have on the screen right here is Idaho's initial language for their section on religious worship and liberty of conscience. Now, Idaho clearly also has that liberty of conscience and licentiousness clause as highlighted there, but they go one step further as to identify one kind of licentiousness as polygamous or other pernicious practices. They also go forward and ban any person, organization, or association from aiding, abetting, counseling, or advising any person to commit bigamy or polygamy. So not only do they include the clause about licentiousness, which they define further as polygamy, they also go as far as to say you cannot aid or abet or counsel anybody to also commit this crime, even though the crime is already federally illegal. So Idaho clearly feels the pressures from the region to expound on these protections and what is illegal. And I believe this language is actually fairly targeted towards certain religious practices without naming the name of who it's targeted towards. And we see that it ends up in this initial language. So they do feel those pressures. And I'll discuss those pressures a little further when I talk about the amendments that were proposed to this section, but I'm also gonna leave this discussion open to my colleague Ashlynn, who's gonna discuss it a lot further. Now, there were a couple amendments that were proposed to Idaho's section on religious worship and freedom of consciousness. The first comes from a man named Mr. King, who actually attempts to remove the entirety of that licentiousness clause whatsoever. He tries to remove all the bit about polygamy and bigamy. And the big wall of text you see there is actually his reasons where he goes line by line as to why he wants to remove each section. Now, I'm not gonna make you read it all. I'm gonna boil it down for you. Basically what he says is, these crimes are already federally illegal. And there's nothing in Idaho's constitution that would allow for someone to believe they are permissible under religious worship or freedom of consciousness without these provisions being in there. What he goes on further to say is, if we're going to exclude these crimes in particular, we should also include the crimes of murder, and he lists a bunch of other crimes. And so he says he believes that they are not necessary to actually achieving the goals that those in the Idaho Constitution or convention would like to achieve. Now, this clause, this amendment that Mr. King proposes goes extremely well and when I say extremely well, I mean absolutely horribly. They completely reject his amendment, and it gets rejected to the point where the next piece of legislation that is proposed onto this section is actually a doubling down of the restrictions against bigamy and polygamy. Now we see here a man named Mr. Ainsley. He actually gives us an amendment that further bans bigamy and polygamy in the state, and it provides for the Legislative Assembly to be the ones who determine the punishments for these crimes. So not only was Mr. King's amendment to remove the language lambasted and rejected, it also furthered the efforts to ban these crimes within Idaho's Constitution. This amendment passes and ends up in the finalized language of their section of the Bill of Rights. Now, another part that's up for debate in the state of Idaho actually is another clause they tried to add, which deals with oaths or affirmations pertaining to voting and the use of or the acquiring of public lands, saying that your religious freedom of conscience cannot be used to dispense with the oaths of affirmations that would be taken in those instances. And the reason we actually bring this up here, because this language is not passed either. This language is rejected, but it seems slightly more targeted than maybe some of the other language that we see. They directly go after a specific group of people within the debates. They leave it out of the language as well. But what we see is not a rejection of the idea proposed through this amendment, but more so a rejection of where this amendment will lie within the Constitution. And that's given to us by Mr. Mayhew in the middle here, where Mr. Mayhew says, this amendment is a good one and should appear in some part of the Constitution, but it belongs to that portion of the Constitution in relation to franchises and elections, not with the Bill of Rights. So ultimately, it's not the disenfranchisement of a certain group of people that turns them off to this amendment. It's more where it's going to lie in the Constitution when it's all said and done. And so I found that to be incredibly interesting. And this amendment in the language does actually show up later in the Constitution, which we will discuss as well. Now, the last amendment we see proposed onto Idaho's Declaration of Rights that deals with freedom of consciousness and the worship is actually a small little section there that adds to pay tithes or pay tithes into the section of what cannot be, but what is not permitted to be required of the citizens of the state. So they add this clause of not paying tithes, and I found it incredibly interesting that it passes, considering the reason for Mr. Clark proposing it he gives us is that we would not want someone who lives in a Mormon settlement who would be required to pay tithes and whose water rights are protected or guaranteed by the Mormon settlement to not have the access to water because they did not want to pay tithes. So what he's trying to protect is your ability to worship as you see fit when he proposes this amendment. But the fact that he calls out the Mormons, I think, hints at what we'll see in the further discussion and debates in Wyoming and Idaho. And I thought that it was incredibly interesting how they allowed this language to both pass and end up in the final language within this section of the Bill of Rights. Now, the next part of our presentation is going to actually discuss some of the other federal language that guided these states as well, and it will dig deeper into the question of the targeted language. And for this, I'm going to pass it on to Caleb.
Good afternoon, everyone. First off, I would like to echo my colleagues' thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities and to Pembroke College for everything they have done in association with this project, the funding, the assistance, the help, everything. So I first want to start off my presentation by shifting a focus a bit and talking about Blaine amendments. In all 5 states, located in their education articles are provisions that ban public funding for sectarian schools. These provisions, as we will see later, were required by enabling acts for Washington and the Dakotas. As mentioned earlier, Idaho and Wyoming did not have enabling acts, but we can see the same provision in their constitutions as well. Blaine amendments, which are named after James G. Blaine, a member of the U.S. House from Maine, who introduced a constitutional amendment constitutional amendment to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights that would add language preventing public funds or lands from going to sectarian schools. This amendment obviously failed, but led to many states adding similar provisions to their constitutions. While the word sectarian is now often interpreted as a synonym to religious, this was not the case in the 1800s. In an article published in the Federalist Society Review by Robert G. Nadelson, he finds that, quote, the definitions of sectarian in the 19th century were, 1, they state directly that a sectarian was a dissenter or otherwise out of the mainstream. 2, associate the word with a negative term, such as prejudice, bigot, or heretic. Or 3, do both. As we will see later on, this is the case, as several of the territories attempt to add the word religion as well in their Blaine amendments. The debates surrounding these provisions also give us an important insight into what attitudes people held about religion and the separation of church and state. So I just wanted to show you guys, sorry, I keep looking up there, but it's better to look there, that this is the federal language provided to Washington and the Dakotas through their Enabling Act. These territories were required to include a provision that captured the intentions of the federal language. Idaho and Wyoming, who didn't have an Enabling Act requiring the provision, still felt they needed to include it, yet their sections are quite different from those who had the language provided. So up there, I've got the Blaine Amendments as they appear in the Constitution when signed. So these are the final versions in Idaho and Wyoming. As you can see, these sections are much larger than the language in the Enabling Act, and both states have 2 sections. Both Section 8 of Wyoming's Constitution and Section 5 of Idaho's Constitution have similar language that prohibits the use of public funds for sectarian or religious schools. Both states' second sections include language preventing the use of tests, with Wyoming using sectarian tests and Idaho preventing religious tests. Both states also prevent any requirement for attendance to religious services. The last line in Wyoming's second section prevents the teachings of sectarian tenets and doctrines, while Idaho goes a step further and not only prevents the teachings of sectarian tenets and doctrines, but also bans books, papers, tracts, or documents of a political, sectarian, or denominational character in any public schools. Washington's Blaine Amendment is the shortest. This section simply states that schools supported by public funds will be forever free from sectarian control or influence. North Dakota's last sentence of Section 156 is similarly short and contains language akin to Washington's. South Dakota's first sentence of Section 16 again uses very similar language, while also interestingly disallows any county or municipality from accepting any grants or gifts that would be used for sectarian purposes. The final sentence is a ban on sectarian instruction, which is not included in the other 2 states. Out of the 5 states, 3 include a ban on sectarian instruction, Wyoming and South Dakota, and Idaho being the third, banning sectarian and religious instruction. Idaho and Wyoming also ban religious and sectarian tests for their schools. I again think it is interesting to note the similarities between Idaho and Wyoming sections, who did not have an Enabling Act, and the similarities between the other 3 states, who share an Enabling Act. While Wyoming and the Dakotas do not attempt to change any changes to these sections nor debate them and remain unchanged from the original committee reports. Sorry, didn't mean to switch that early. Idaho and Washington's attempted changes, and subsequent debates provide important insights about religious attitudes in the 19th century West and the idea of separation of church and state. Okay, the first and only change made to Idaho's Section 7 comes from Mr. Clark, which is the addition of "or religious" at the end of the section. Not only is this important for recognizing that sectarian was not synonymous with religious at the time, his explanation for making the amendment gives us an idea of the intention behind it. He makes the amendment because he wants to ensure that these entities cannot evade this provision. The amendment is not made in order to apply this provision equally, rather it is made to further ensure these sectarian institutions do not receive any public funds. Next, we move on to a series of 3 attempted amendments to Section 8. To Section 8. Mr. Clark's attempted amendment and the subsequent debate is particularly interesting as it attempts to include a provision that allows for the reading of the Bible in schools. This sharp contrast with this provision and the sentence just above it again shows that sectarian did not necessarily mean religious. The arguments for and against this amendment also show several different attitudes towards the nature of the relationship between church and state. Mr. Clark's explanation of his amendment is quite federalist and argues that by including the provision, the matter is simply better left to the people to choose whether they want it in their district. Mr. Parker has an argument that is sort of a Pandora's box argument. He believes that by opening this door, this could allow Mormons to claim the right to teach the doctrines of Mormonism, and that Catholics may claim the right to teach their doctrines as well. Instead, it is safer to leave the section as is. Mr. Reed's argument is a purely religious one, and he believes our country is great and glorious because the Bible is read and taught. He does not want to see a constitution that does not recognize this constitutional Jehovah, and therefore supports the amendment. On slide 7, we have Mr. Hasbrook's amendment, which is adopted, provides another important confirmation that sectarian and religious were not synonymous at this time. As he says in his explanation for his amendment, the goal of his amendment is to strengthen the section by further banning sectarian instruction, by banning books, papers, tracts, or documents of a political, sectarian, or denominational character. After Mr. Reed asks if the superintendent could exclude the Bible on the grounds that it was sectarian, Mr. Hasbrook replies that he does not think it would allow for that. Mr. Claggett's attempted amendment, at least to me, is most interesting in that the debates sparked are particularly of note. He attempts to include a provision that allows the Bible to be taught in schools, but only as inculcate lessons of morality. Mr. Claggett acknowledges that the Bible is a sectarian text in the context of all the great religions of the world, and believes that by excluding the religious sections of the book, we are left with the most complete collection of practical lessons on morality. Mr. Reed, who earlier made a religious argument, again here makes a particularly intense case for keeping the Bibles in schools. He argues that the portions that would be removed under this provision, such as the story of Joseph, are the most beautiful lessons of morality contained in the Bible. The last portion of his debate is particularly strong, as he states that if you leave the Bible and its teachings out of the new government and constitution, quote, the Christian people of the territory will rise up and put their foot on it. We have continued debate on this amendment. Mr. Parker's amendment against is very similar to his arguments against Mr. Clark's amendment, that by putting this provision in the Constitution, it would overwhelm the public school system by opening the door for sectarian denominations to introduce their doctrines in the school system. Mr. Ansley's opposition to the amendment is more of a separation of church and state argument than Mr. Parker's, saying that the Bible is a religious book and that it does not belong in public schools and instead its place is in church. Note that he also mentions the distinction between sectarian and religious, saying, quote, I believe the Bible is without a doubt a religious book. They say it is not a sectarian book, but that is a religious book, there is no doubt. These debates in Idaho, while showing that sectarian was not synonymous with religious at the time, also provide a unique insight into debates around religion, separation of church and state, and religion in schools during the 19th century. I also briefly want to point to Washington as well, as there are 3 attempted amendments. The first attempts to ban religious instructions. The second attempt is to change the word sectarian to religious, which at the time would have applied the rule more equally. And the third to remove or influence. Although either no debate exists for these amendments or we were unable to locate those records, these amendments closely resemble some of the attempted amendments in Idaho and are most likely attempting to achieve similar purposes. Now I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and switch to something that is particularly interesting in the states of Wyoming and Idaho, and kind of a bit of an introduction for our final presenter, Ashlynn. In Wyoming, we noticed a file being introduced, file number 93, that bans polygamists and bigamists, or those who are believers in or enter into what is known as plural or celestial marriage. Mr. Burritt, as you can see by his reasoning on the screen, when introducing the file, says that this is a proposition of Edmunds-Tucker law and believes that it is necessary to include in the Constitution. And this is where our questions began. Mr. Burritt references the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, which was law passed by Congress directed at Utah specifically, but the section he introduces is much more similar to the Edmunds Act of 1882. As far as we could tell, both of these acts were simply laws and did not require these states to enshrine portions of these laws within their constitutions. But it seems that Mr. Burritt certainly felt that this provision needed to be included. And later in this debate, as we will see in the next presentation, he mentions Idaho's similar provisions during their convention. We decided to look in Idaho to see if there were clues as to why Mr. Burritt may have believed that they needed this provision in their constitution, and we found a series of 4 speeches. It is worth noting before I get into these speeches that these speeches were given on July 23rd in Idaho, while the file introduced by Mr. Burritt happens on September 28th in Wyoming. All 4 of these speeches are given by members of the U.S. House of Congress. The first speech, given by Mr. Stewart, addresses the so-called Mormon question. He references the fact that he was on the Edmunds-Tucker committee, and he describes the Mormons as a, quote, wonderfully aggressive and ably managed conspiracy, and compares it to the Jewish theocracy. He also mentions looking at 2 reports from committee, a majority report and a minority report. Given the context of the debates in Idaho and the provision in Wyoming, we believe it is safe to assume the reports he is referring to are the reports from the Election and Suffrage Committee. Mr. Stewart recommends the one with stronger language, as it would help the chances of their constitution being accepted. Mr. Burroughs' speech is similarly strong, beginning with telling delegates of a constitutional convention for a Western state, one that is a member of the Great Basin Desert, that their biggest obstacle to their admission is not irrigation, rather that it is the question of Mormonism. He mentions that if his vote and voice can prevent it, Utah will never be part of the Union until she, quote, wipes from her escutcheon, the abomination of the 19th century. He finishes by suggesting that they must go further than just prohibiting polygamy, but must allow the legislature the ability to make it impossible for the civil affairs of the state to be dominated by a power foreign to the state. Mr. Dorsey's speech, while the shortest, again reinforces the idea that the so-called Mormon question is a serious problem and tells the delegates they must guard against it. The last speech by Mr. Goff uses perhaps the strongest language of them all. He tells these delegates that if he were handling the Mormon question, he would make sure that, quote, this great monster of the century is to be thoroughly exterminated. He mentions strangling the monster twice in that same paragraph, and then tells the delegates that they would not fear missing out on statehood if they were able to solve the problem. He finishes by saying that when Idaho comes to Washington, D.C., the first thing the representatives will look at is how they have handled this question, and only then will they move on to evaluating the rest of their constitution. The reason we decided to highlight these speeches is that they could potentially be one of the reasons that Wyoming felt it might be necessary to incorporate languages of the Edmunds Act, as well as to highlight the immense pressure that Idaho would have been feeling after these speeches to answer the so-called Mormon question. In the next presentation, we will get to see what the results of that pressure was. And I turn the time over to Ashlynn.
Hello, good afternoon, and my thanks to the NEH grant, Oxford University, and the CCS for welcoming me back after it's been 2 years since I graduated. Is this better? Yes, thank you. I heard some people leaning in, so I appreciate it. All right, to start, as Caleb just mentioned, the immense pressures from Congress and also from the states are here. I just click that? Perfect. Pressure from the territories is also present. These are territories that don't have the same rights as states do. And so they are wanting the autonomy and credibility of being an official state of the union to provide. With the pressure they want to submit in a one and done swoop, the delegates of both Idaho and Wyoming wanted to ensure their constitutions they had drafted were hardy enough to be accepted by Congress. Being border territories of Utah, Idaho and Wyoming were well aware that only 2 years previously, Utah had tried to become a state and failed due to polygamy and other Mormon practices. The delegates from both conventions wanted to outlaw polygamy and prohibit the Mormons from combining church and state powers in order to better their territory's chances of becoming a state. At this time, the concerns toward Mormons combining the organizations of church and state were warranted. In early Mormon history, the Mormons were displaced from Illinois to Missouri and eventually to the territory of Utah due to the power and sway they had on local politics and in the communities they lived in. The Mormons would create a large presence in these communities where they were living and influence politics so much that it would combine the powers of church and state. Idaho and Wyoming saw this as a threat, and they did not want a similar situation of what happened in previous states and territories to happen in their states. I'm not sure why the image is there, but that's all right. Throughout the remainder of this presentation, we can see the influence of these different pressures with both with the desire to become a state as soon as possible and the pressure from Congress to snub out the burning problem of the Mormon question. We start in Idaho with Article 6, Section 3 with the following wording. No person is permitted to vote, serve as a juror, or hold any civil office who is a bigamist or a polygamist living in what is known as patriarchal, plural, or celestial marriage, or in violation of any law of this state or of the United States forbidding any such crime, or who in any manner teaches, advises, counsels, aids, or encourages any person to enter into bigamy, polygamy, or such patriarchal, plural, or celestial marriage, or to live in violation of any such law, or to commit any crime, or who is a member or contributes to the support, aid, or encouragement of any order, organization, association, cooperation, or society which teaches, advises, counsels, encourages, or aids any person to enter into bigamy, polygamy, or such patriarchal or plural marriage, or which teaches or advises that the laws of the state prescribing the rules of civil conduct are not the supreme law of the state. From this rather intense language, we can see that Idaho starts with two things. One, they don't use the term Mormon in their constitution. Rather, they use terms that are used by the Mormon faith to define their religious practices, such as patriarchal, plural, or celestial marriage. Two, they use strong language that prohibits anyone who is involved with the Mormon practices from voting in the state of Idaho. They start by calling out anyone who practices or encourages polygamists, but they go one step further to include the following text, and emphasizing who in any manner is a member or contributes, supports, aid, or encouragement of, to any organization, association, corporation, or society which teaches, advises, counsels, encourages, or aids. Essentially, they're trying to create this massive umbrella that encapsulates anyone who'd be associated at all with any kind of membership toward the Mormon Church, and trying to strip them of the rights to vote. This text regarding the Mormons, though thoroughly debated, this here above me, does not change throughout the remainder of the convention. We can see, however, the convention does propose several amendments to further ensure that the Mormons cannot vote or have any political say. To start us off, we have Mr. Gray. He recommends that we insert, and who has not been restored to the rights of citizenship, here in the blue, into this as well. This was met with immediate opposition by another delegate, Mr. Beatty, who was concerned that by inserting even the possibility of restoring anyone's ability to vote through the power of a pardon, it could potentially lead to the restoration of a former polygamist's ability to vote. Mr. Beatty goes on to say that regarding the Mormons, I do not believe those men, even if they should be pardoned out, would be worthy of the franchise. In response to this, Mr. Gray replies in defense of the pardoning power, even saying that with the pardon would be sufficient for use under any and all circumstances, which would include polygamy. And he states that Idaho must abide by the clemency which the pardoning power has. Mr. Gray then explains the value of the pardon and how it can be used to incentivize those who'd been convicted of high crimes to seek opportunity, and includes punishment is not alone for the purpose of torture, but for reformation. Regardless of this powerful defense for the power of the pardon, Mr. Gray's amendment is put to vote and rejected by the convention. As we mentioned earlier, this section is all about targeting the Mormons without actually saying the word Mormon. As the debate for Section 3 continues, an unknown amendment was proposed that inserts additional language targeted toward Mormons. It adds another clause under which anyone who claims to have direct revelation from God to commit these crimes, referring to the Mormon leaders who practice polygamy, would also be disenfranchised. Ultimately, this additional language was rejected, but we can see that the delegates from Idaho were determined to further encompass anyone who was a part of the Mormon umbrella. Moving forward and away from Section 3, Mr. Beatty offers a substitute amendment saying, the legislature may prescribe qualifications, limitations, and conditions for the right of suffrage concerning the classes and persons referred to in the immediately preceding section, additional to those prescribed therein, but shall never annul provision in this article contained. this amendment was further clarified by Mr. Ainsley, and he stated that the intention was to ensure that the legislature had power to disenfranchise Mormons thoroughly and would continue to have that power in the future. To the surprise of these two gentlemen, Mr. Beatty in particular, the substitute amendment was highly debated. Here we see Mr. Claggett has immediate concerns, stating, if that same church turns around and has revelation and goes under its oath, should come up and go on and claim that they are good, law-abiding citizens and recognize the supremacy of the civil law and all manners of civil conduct, then they are swept out of these restrictions. Mr. Claggett believes that he believes that what they've recently adopted, or what they will adopt in Section 3, is sufficient, because it stated those who are associated with the Mormon Church are already disenfranchised. If, however, Mormons were to ever come into any type of political power or influence, this section would go from being the section that Mr. Beatty's proposing, would go from being a tool against Mormons to being a primary tool to aid their enfranchisement and to support Mormon beliefs. At this point in the convention, we can see the delegates had an obvious and deep disdain for the Mormons. When Mr. Claggett points out the substitute amendment proposed can be used to eventually open the doors of Mormon enfranchisement, Mr. Beatty takes this critique to a personal level, stating, if for one moment I thought this opened the doors to the enfranchisement of the Mormons and that hateful church, I would go back as far as any man, back upon my word, if it was best to go back on my word. He then offers a defense to the substitute amendment, saying that he was under the understanding and with the belief that this amendment does not change the relations at all of this church, does not give any opportunity possible for the chance for them to come in and obtain enfranchisement under this provision. Rather, he believed it gave power to the legislature to legislate Mormon policy as it pleases. Between this debate and the final vote of the convention, between this debate and the final vote, the convention takes a break for lunch, whereafter Mr. Beatty returns and desires to withdraw his substitute amendment immediately, meaning what he just proposed. The other delegates, however, prevented this from happening because there was a split on the interpretation of what the substitute meant. The substitute amendment is forced to go to vote, where it narrowly fails, with those in favor totaling 24 and those opposed totaling to 31. Further examples are found throughout the convention for additional language targeted against the Mormons. Mr. Morgan proposes an additional phrase to be inserted into Section 3 that includes those who participate in unlawful cohabitation. This language comes from the Edmunds Act that was used to initially disempower Mormons in the Utah Territory. Once the amendment is pointed out to be redundant and unnecessary, however, Mr. Morgan immediately withdraws his amendment. Moving on to the Mormon question in Wyoming, we can read in File 93, as previously mentioned, that this is concerning qualifications of electors. It reads, no person shall be permitted to vote, serve as a juror, or hold any civil office who has at any time been convicted of infamous crime and not being restored to the rights of citizenship, or as a bigamist or a polygamist, or as a believer in or enters into what is known as plural or celestial marriage, or in violation of any law of this state or of the United States affecting any such crime. As we can see, this is another example of targeted legislation focused on the disenfranchisement of Mormons. It is critical to note that Mr. Burritt, who proposed this file, only did so because he was under the impression that a provision that prohibited Mormon suffrage was required for Wyoming to be granted statehood. This proposed file is met with two primary concerns that are addressed as follows. The first is from Mr. Russell, who rises in opposition, saying that he believes this file will do more harm than good to the people of Wyoming. He states it makes little difference as to their belief. If they are good, law-abiding citizens, why should you point a finger at them specifically? He goes on to say that he believes that Wyoming is a state where Mormons aren't a problem. And even if they were, he believes Wyoming would be able to cope with these people, though through their regular legislative channels established through their constitution. The second point of concern is brought up by Mr. Clark, who opposed the file solely because he believes it is not right to select any one class of crime from the rest of crimes. and say that persons who have been guilty of that special crime shall be disqualified from holding certain offices of trust or from voting. If the resolution would include other crimes, such as horse stealing or murder, and including them all together, he would then not object. But because it specifies the Mormons and points them out, he's opposed to it. This is when we hear from Mr. Burritt, who also has strong feelings about the disenfranchisement of Mormons, where he states that the file he presented is a mild proposition, comparing this one here to what we just read about in Idaho. And he said if Wyoming had to accept the same provisions that Idaho has to in order to qualify for statehood, he would altogether prefer to stay out, meaning he would rather Wyoming stay a territory than become a state with such extreme language against Mormon suffrage. After the initial debate on File 93 in Wyoming, the convention takes a break, at which time Mr. Burritt mentions that he and other members of the Committee on Elections and Suffrage took great pains to ascertain whether it was the opinion of those posted at Washington if this proposition was necessary, meaning if it was necessary to disenfranchise Mormons. And he continues to share, I believe this morning that it was. And I so stated when I offered the proposition, I thought it was expedient. And I am satisfied now, after having spent the entire time since this was referred to committee in consulting all those in the city who would be competent to express an opinion on the subject, that I was wrong. With his final comments, we see the death of File 93 in the Convention of Wyoming. This issue of the Mormon question is no longer debated or addressed for the remainder of their convention. Throughout our presentation, we have seen common thread of territories following various provisions to better their chances for statehood, whether it was for provisions related to the Bill of Rights or banning the use of public funds for sectarian schools, or related to polygamy and the provisions outlined in the Edmunds-Tucker Act, along with the intense pressure from Congress. We can see how these anxieties led to different outcomes among the 5 different states. Yes. There. Thanks all.
You want to take some questions? I believe we have just a couple of minutes. If anyone has any questions for our students, the presenters. Anthony?
So my question is, were there any Mormon delegates at the convention? And if so, and as a related question to that, did the states have different, what impact did the population of Mormons within these different states affect, if at all, the type of bills and things discussed regarding the Mormon question?
Sorry, can you please repeat that question for the screen?
I think I'm sorry. I'll bring you in.
So it's two parts of a question. The first part is, were there Mormon delegates at the convention? And the second part is, what relationship this one might not have as clear as an answer in the text, so I mean, you might not have an answer, but what role did the amount of Mormons in one of these territories have in the decision-making for the Mormon question?
Really good questions. Is it not on? There we go. Light is on. Really good questions. The first one, no, there were no Mormon delegates in either Idaho or Wyoming. And as far as the population, it's reported that Idaho had about 25,000. Well, I don't know what that is proportionally. That is significantly more than what was in Wyoming, which is only reported to have maybe 1% of Mormons in their territory.
Right. Brief questions? One right there. There you go. Rachel's already reached. Student.
Okay, cool. So with, I guess, all the things that happened with the government and the LDS faith, did this cause the LDS faith to write the manifesto which supposedly banned plural marriage from the state of Utah?
his question was, did these provisions, these exclusions from suffrage and disenfranchisement, result in the manifesto that abandoned polygamy, celestial marriage?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the church and why they wrote the manifesto. I can say it was heavily influenced by all these legislative federal pressures, and Utah, the territory, wanted to become a state. So there was definitely some influence there.
One last question. I think Dr. Cole had one.
So I have a comment and a question. My comment is I'm glad in a conference where we've really focused on the positive side of constitution writing that we also get to reflect that sometimes, these processes can be used to oppress as well. But my question is, did anybody in these conventions express concern at banning a belief rather than an act? Because it seems very surprising to have constitutional law in America specifically targeting a belief in celestial marriage rather than a particular act. And I wonder if any of the delegates ever commented on that distinction.
I'm trying to think of how I want to formulate this. They didn't recall anything on the belief part of it. They didn't say, well, they believe polygamy to be from God. It was very much, this is an act we don't approve of. And then with the influence, kind of the history of the Mormon church being able to have such a sway over church and state, I think they let that take more of a predominant say than what their beliefs may say, because that's what caused them to move from Illinois to Missouri to then Utah. It was a pushing out. They didn't like the way that the Mormons would influence the politics in the area, essentially.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to our panel. We've come to the end of our conference, and as we were planning this, I had just a little bit of anxiety several months ago as we were thinking about this, about state constitutions. Will it generate that much? We know how important this is, but will it generate that much interest? Will we really be able to convey its importance? And I have to report after 2 days, I really feel like we succeeded in conveying to people just how critical state constitution making is and how important a part of our constitutional tradition this is. And as I keep repeating, that part of it that constitutes ongoing self-government and not just some past episode in our constitutional tradition. In wrapping up the conference, I want to say thanks to some very important folks. Obviously, we have tremendous gratitude for those who support the center, for those in the university who have who come alongside us and help us to serve our students and serve the community in Utah County and throughout the state, inside the university and outside of it, and the partnerships we form there. Many of you in this room, I actually see many of the members of our board of advisors in this room, which has been a body that has been an invaluable source of support and advice and guidance to our center. But I also want to thank internally, the Center for Constitutional Studies relies tremendously on our operations staff. Autumn Christensen just joined us. We, with tremendous glee, stole her from BYU's law school. And she's been a great asset to us. Paige Larson, as our center's admin, is invaluable in keeping the train on the tracks. And I want to say, Scott Paul is our executive director. And you've seen him wear the hat, if you've been around, of how he directs these undergraduate research assistants. Scott is doing the job of a faculty mentor and a scholar who's directing their efforts and overseeing them, and has been a tremendous mentor to them and seen many of our students off in academic programs. Anthony just asked a question. I'm going to embarrass him right now. He is in a PhD program at Missouri right now, preparing to write a dissertation on state constitutionalism. So we're moving forward the study of these things in all sorts of ways. And I don't even want to start enumerating all of the places our students have gone because we'll be here a while. But we're tremendously proud of them. And I am tremendously grateful for the staff that has mentored them, makes events like this possible and makes them run. And say, you know, I show up and say nice things. And really the work here has been done by so many others. So I'm grateful for that and would like you all to recognize it as well. Well, I will close by looking to the future, just as state constitutionalism looks to the future, and you consider all those things. The center is looking to the future. We have many initiatives underway. Our Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative, funded by the state legislature, has our Civic Educators Conference coming up next month, which will consider the subject of civics in the home, how parents and teachers partner to equip our young people to be citizens and to contribute to a just, free, and flourishing society. We have in the spring, I want you to be on the lookout for our First Amendment Conference and hope you'll come back for that, where we will consider the oft-neglected right to assemble, peaceable assembly, and what goes with it, the right to freely associate. We actually saw in some of these slides discussions of associations and corporations. That is, efforts by people to gather together in groups and pursue a common aim. And it's quite often that the political community is threatened by the efforts of people to associate with those with whom they disagree or pursue their aims in common. And we're going to consider that right. It's quite crucial. There are very few of your First Amendment rights, I'd hazard a guess, that you often exercise alone. You quite often exercise them in a group, just as we are right now. Well, this whole exercise in evaluating our constitutional order is an exercise of association, assembly, speech, maybe for those of you who really love the Constitution, maybe even free exercise of religion. But I hope you'll join us for those future events and be on the lookout for more. We want to partner with you. If anything here has piqued your interest, please get in touch with us and find a way to get involved. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you've benefited from what we've been doing. Have a great afternoon.